The drunk's daughter was tied to the market post for shame until a lonely rancher brought her bread and a new life. New Mexico Territory, late spring of 1873. The sun sat high and merciless above the clay rooftops and wooden planks of Dry Creek, casting shadows sharp enough to cut skin. The market square buzzed with quiet cruelty. Erin Dalton stood bound to the center post, wrists raw against the sun-scorched rope. Her back straight though her legs had begun to tremble. Sweat carved lines down her dusty skin. Her eyes were hollow but not broken. "She is just like her daddy," one woman sneered. "That girl is Henry Dalton's blood, no mistaking it," another added, folding her arms. "He used to smash liquor bottles over people's heads and laugh like it was a Sunday hymn. She owes for flour, pork fat, cough syrup, and she walks around like the past gone with the wind." A grocer's wife snapped. A man spat near the post. "Her paw shattered my front window last fall. Let her stand there. Fair's fair." From the edge of the square, Pastor Collins climbed the steps of the stone well. Bible in hand, voice rolling through the heat like thunder. "Sin must be laid bare so the soul may be cleansed," he called. "This town will not be dragged into the pit by those who mistake pity for penance. That girl plays saint while carrying the blood of a drunkard." Karen said nothing. She did not plead, did not look down. Her eyes, once bright with schoolroom dreams, held only the weary stillness of someone long since resigned. No one remembered she had once taught letters to the ranchhand's children, or that she had stitched her father's coat through nights of silence and whiskey fumes. They forgot how she had bowed to every debt he left behind, swallowing pride like dry ash. Now without coin to repay the damages of her father's last rampage, the broken window, the ruined medicine stock, the poisoned water from the overturned well, she was punished as if the sins were carved into her own skin. Around her the crowd thinned, sun drove them to shade, but judgment kept their eyes fixed. Then from the road bordering the square, a figure emerged. Daniel Mercer, tall, lean, wrapped in a worn duster and the silence of grief. A man who had not set foot in church since the war ended, who lived on the edge of canyonlands, where only wind and memory kept company. His wife had died 5 winters back. Folks said he talked more to horses than humans. Few noticed him until he stopped. He looked at Karen, not with scorn, not with pity, just a quiet, assessing calm, like a man sizing up a wounded colt that still had fire left in its legs. From his sack, he pulled a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, fresh, still warm. He stepped through the gathering, his boots stirring dust. A hush fell. Daniel said nothing. He approached the post slowly, eyes never leaving Karen's. Then with the gentlest motion, as if laying a baby down to sleep, he set the bread on her lap. He reached behind her and loosened the knot with steady hands. The rope slipped away like it had never belonged there. Karen did not flinch. Daniel stepped back, still silent. Then he turned and walked away, not hurried, not afraid, just a man who had done what he came to do. The square erupted, not in noise, but in whispers, in gasps, like sharp wind. What the hell was that? Implicational. Gave her bread like she deserved kindness. As he lost his damn mind, Pastor Collins gripped his Bible tighter, but said nothing. Karen looked down at the loaf, her hands, still trembling, did not reach for it. But her eyes, those tired eyes, held the faintest flicker, a crack in the stone, a breath in the silence. The town would speak of it for weeks. But no one, no preacher, no merchant, no gossip, could erase what they saw that day. A girl long condemned. And a man who gave her bread, a simple act. But in a town built on judgment, it sounded like rebellion. The dust of Dry Creek still clung to her dress as Karen crossed the hills toward home. Her wrists, red from rope burn, throbbed with every step. The town had emptied of faces, but not of judgment. It followed her like the wind. By the time she reached the edge of the prairie, the sun had begun to set behind the ridges. Her cabin, if one could call it that, leaned sideways like an old man near collapse. The door creaked open with a sigh, as if even the wood pied her. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and sweat. Her father, Henry Dalton, lay on the cot, snoring unevenly. An empty tin cup lay on the floor near his hand, sticky with whatever rotgut he had bartered for last week. Aaron lit the oil lamp with trembling fingers. The flame fluttered low, casting shadows on the splintered walls and rain-stained ceiling. This was home now, a shack that coughed when the wind blew and whimpered when it rained. A place she had once dreamed of leaving, a place she now could not afford to. She took a damp rag, knelt by the hearth, and scrubbed the blood from her wrists in silence. Days passed. She patched the roof with old feed sacks and newspaper. She boiled turnips with bones too old for flavor. Her dreams of becoming a schoolteacher faded like the ink on her old spelling books, now tucked under a broken floorboard, safe from mice, but not from time. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast. Sheets of rain, howling wind, and a chill that bit through even the thickest blanket. Karen placed buckets under the leaks, her hands shaking with exhaustion. By dawn, the storm passed. So had one of the leaks. Karen blinked. Then stepped outside. New shingles, mismatched, weathered, but solid, nailed in with a craftsman's care. She touched the rope that held the tarp. Its knot was familiar. Later that day, she found a sack of potatoes resting gently on the window ledge. No note, no knock, no sound, but she knew. The knot told her, the quiet told her. Ah, it was Daniel Mercer, the man who had untied her, the man who gave bread to the shamed girl in the market. A day later, the well crank jammed for 3 years turned like it had never rusted. She nearly wept when clean water poured into her bucket. Karen said nothing, but that night she took an old kettle, scrubbed it with ashen soap until it gleamed silver again, and placed it on the porch beside a chipped enamel cup. Tucked beneath the kettle a note, "If you ever come back, I have hot water." She waited 3 days. Then, on the 4th morning, the kettle was empty. The cup had moved. That evening, just before twilight, she saw him. Daniel sat at the edge of her garden where the fence sagged inward. He held nothing, said nothing. Karen walked to the porch, poured warm tea, rivermint, and dandelion from the kettle, and brought 2 cups. She handed him one. He took it. They sat in silence as the prairie turned gold around them. He did not speak of the town. She did not speak of shame. They watched the grass move slow and soft in the wind. Karen glanced at him once. His face was unreadable, but his stillness was kind. Not empty, just quiet. For the first time in months, her spine loosened. Her chest expanded without pain. When the cup was empty, Daniel nodded, stood, and walked away into the dusk. She watched until his shadow faded. Then she whispered to the wind, "You do not have to speak to be heard." And for once the silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. The heat of midsummer settled over Dry Creek like a second skin. Sticky, inescapable. Dust clung to every boot and bonnet, and with it came whispers. Whispers that carried louder than shouts. Karen Dalton walked down the main street with her head high, hands clasped behind her back, and a basket hanging from one wrist. She was thinner now, her eyes darker, her steps quieter, but she did not slink. Murmurs followed her like crows. There she goes, acting like she belongs here. She never answered for what her daddy did. Silence is the devil's camouflage. From the church steps, Reverend Collins watched her with a face carved from stone. The Bible in his hand was open, his voice sharp, slicing through the lazy afternoon. Sin that hides in silence furs. Complicity is the sister of corruption. Let not your mercy cloud your judgment. A woman who walks in shadows walks with shadows. Karen said nothing. She kept walking. Near the apothecary, a boy, no more than 8, broke from his mother's grasp, ran up, and spit at her feet. The wet slap of saliva on her boot made her freeze. Gasps followed, then hush. Karen did not flinch. She looked at the boy. He stared back, proud, defiant. Then a shadow passed over them both. Daniel Mercer stood between them. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. Instead, he knelt, plucked a tiny wild flower from between the planks of the boardwalk and handed it to the boy. The child blinked, confused. His mother pulled him away with a harsh whisper. Daniel remained kneeling. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a cloth, worn, old, embroidered with a faded L, and gently wiped the spit from Karen's boot. She opened her mouth to speak, but he shook his head, but it was not shame in his touch. It was reverence. He stood, nodded once, then turned and walked away. Karen stood still, the flower crushed. Under her heel, her eyes stinging, not from insult, but something else. Later that day, as the sky bruised into evening, she placed a loaf of cornbread on the windowsill. Nestled inside, wrapped in paper, a note written with care. I am not worthy of your kindness, but I remember it. The next morning, a new gate stood at the entrance to her yard. Pinewood, strong, sanded, smooth hinges that did not creak. No signature, no initials, just a gate that closed softly, like someone finally meant to stay. She touched it, and the rough wood felt warm beneath her fingers. She sat on the porch with tea that night, alone, watching the stars. She did not see Daniel that day, or the next, but something in her heart shifted like a beam creaking into place. 3 days passed. On the 4th, rain fell gently over the hills. The kind of rain that nourishes, not punishes. Karen sat in the doorway, her knees drawn up, her breath fogging the glass of the cup in her hands. And then it came, the tears, not for the shame or the hunger or the loneliness, but for the first time in her memory, someone had touched her without flinching, without demanding, without expecting her to apologize first. Tears streamed down her face, not loud or wild, but steady, like spring melt from the mountain. He cried for the little girl who had once dreamed of chalkboards and books. For the woman who had survived the storm of other people's sins, for the gate, the flower, the cloth, for the man who did not ask for thanks, only left behind decency in his wake. Inside, her father mumbled something in his sleep. She wiped her face, stood, and closed the door. For the first time in years, it did not creak. The frost came early that year. Karen woke to silence. Not the usual mumbling or bottle clinks from the other side of the room, just a stillness that settled like ash. Her father lay on his side, his hand outstretched toward the cold hearth. His chest no longer rose. She did not cry. She washed his face, changed his shirt, wrapped him in the blanket he used to hate because it smelled like cedar. Then she sat beside him until morning. No one came when she sent word, no neighbors, no pastor, no prayers. She dug the grave herself, her hands blistered from the shovel, her breath fogging in the pale light. When the hole was deep enough, she lowered him in and said, "Only, rest. Just rest." As she finished patting the last mound of dirt, she heard hoof beats. Daniel, he dismounted quietly, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, lavender, prairie daisy, sage. He walked to the grave, knelt, and laid the bundle gently on the soil. Because no matter what else, he said, his voice low and steady, he was still a father. Karen stood motionless, tears caught in her throat, but not falling. Daniel looked at her, then turned and rode off without another word. That night she lit a single candle and sat in the dark, listening to the silence. But the silence no longer frightened her. It was clean, honest. The next day she began to teach again, not at a schoolhouse, but under the elm tree near her porch. 3 children came first, barefoot, shy, curious. Then 2 more. She taught them letters in the dirt, stories from her old books, how to count using stones and buttons. She took no payment, just watched their faces light up. Daniel never said a word about it, but one afternoon she returned from gathering herbs to find a bundle of fresh slate boards in chalk resting by the elm. She smiled, but said nothing. The next week, she found a saddle sitting on her porch. Sturdy, handcrafted, beautiful in its simplicity. Her name Karen was carved into the wood of the pommel, small but unmistakable. When she asked Daniel, he only shrugged. "Put names on the things I respect," he said simply, brushing sawdust from his shirt. That night, the wind blew hard. The sky boiled with thunderclouds. Karen sat by the fire with her lesson notes, unaware of the footsteps gathering outside her home. They came with torches. A voice shouted, "This town does not forget." Another voice Jared, teaching kids like she's some kind of saint. Then came the sound of glass breaking. A rock through her window. Karen ran to the door, but before she could open it, the back wall caught fire. She grabbed a blanket, smothered the flame on the curtain, and screamed into the storm, "I am not my father." But they did not listen. Smoke filled her lungs. Her hands bled from broken glass. She staggered outside as the roof groaned above her. Lightning flashed. And then hoof-beats. Daniel burst through the firelight. Rain pouring off his coat. He leapt from his horse, threw his coat around her shoulders, and without a word lifted her into his arms. She clung to him as he carried her through the flames. The cabin collapsed behind them. Embers flew into the night. Daniel placed her gently onto the saddle, mounted behind her, and rode hard into the dark. Not once did he look back. The ranch sat at the edge of red rock country, where the land began to slope into wilderness, and stars burned clearer and colder at night. Coyotes sang here, not for fear or hunger, but for the pure sound of it. The wind did not whisper through trees. It howled across stone, clean and merciless. Karen had never been this far out. The first morning after the fire, she woke to the soft creak of wood and the smell of cedar. Her cot was simple but clean, pressed near a window that faced the dawn. The cabin was modest, bare walls, no ornaments, only the essentials, but nothing was broken. Nothing felt abandoned. Silence filled the space, but not the kind that judged. It was the kind that waited, patient and without demand. Daniel was already outside, chopping wood. The steady thump of axe meeting pine echoed through the valley. He did not greet her, did not ask how she had slept. He merely handed her a pair of worn gloves and pointed toward the northern fence line. They worked together that day, side by side. Karen's shoulders ached by noon, but she kept at it, matching Daniel post for post, wire for wire. He did not praise her. He did not need to. She saw it in the way he nodded barely once when the final post was set. They ate in near silence that night. She stirred beans and warmed cornbread. He fixed the hinge on a cupboard with quiet concentration. When he passed her the butter, their fingers brushed. It was nothing. It was everything. The next morning, she fed the horse, patched a hole in the water barrel. By midweek, she was planting onions and squash with Daniel on his knees beside her, sleeves rolled, soil caked in the lines of his palms. They did not speak, but sometimes their eyes met, and held a beat longer than before. Afternoons brought a slower pace. Karen stitched, cleaned, sometimes read from an old copy of Whitman she found tucked under a loose floorboard. Daniel built a gate, sharpened tools, tended to the fences. Their lives ran in quiet parallel, separate, but never apart. At dusk, they drank warm water from old tin mugs and watched the sun pour fire over the mesas. Sometimes a bird would call out, sometimes a coyote answered, but mostly it was just the wind and the scrape of chair legs as they sat together alone, but not lonely. Daniel kept a second cut across the room. She noticed the sheets were folded with care. The pillow dented just once each morning. He never crossed the line, never lingered too long. But she caught him watching sometimes. Not her face, but her hands, as it was the kind that waited, patient and without demand. Daniel was already outside, chopping wood. Braided rope. Her legs as she stepped through rows of squash as if remembering someone or letting someone go. Then one night, thunder low in the valley, Daniel left to find a lost calf. Karen wandered into the back room for a blanket. That was when she saw it. Photograph faded, torn. A young woman, hair braided tight, arms crossed, eyes full of fire. Not beautiful, but unforgettable. Fierce in a way Karen recognized. Fierce in a way Karen once was. The frame was dusted with age. She held it gently, did not cry, did not ask. She understood. Daniel had not saved her because she was helpless. He saved her because he knew what it meant to stand in ruin and still believe in kindness. That night when he returned soaked and silent, she gave him a towel and soup. No questions, no pity. She spoke first. "Your wife?" "She looks like someone who didn't back down." He paused, spoon halfway to his lips. "She didn't," he said. she died with her boots on. Karen reached across the table, her hand covering his. And in that small, wordless moment, trust took root. Not love yet, but something just as strong. Silence lay over the ranch that afternoon like a freight train arriving at dusk. Slow, heavy, and unwelcome. Dust curled in the wind, brushing against the porch rails, and the tips of the onion stalks drying under the eaves. A peculiar stillness met the approaching carriage. Its wheels groaning like old bones long before any voices rose from it. The sound drew the attention of every living thing. The chickens hushed. The mare, Hercules, shifted her weight uneasily and snorted. Karen stood at the porch steps, a basket of freshly picked onions in her arms, her breath caught mid-motion. The carriage halted at the edge of the ranched, its wheels sinking slightly into the dirt. Pastor Collins was the first to descend. Thin, sharp-shouldered, eyes narrowed behind wire spectacles, and clutching his Bible like a dagger sheathed in leather. Beside him, Mayor Whitmore followed, slower, heavier, leaning on a polished cane as if it were more weapon than aid. His coat bore the seal of town authority, but his face held the long-practiced look of disdain. They stood at the edge of the yard, framed by dust and disdain. Neither spoke. Daniel appeared from behind the barn. He moved without rush, tall and broad, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. There was no fear in his posture, but there was weight, like a man who had expected this visit since the day the fire lit the horizon behind Karen's old home. Mayor Whitmore was the first to break the hush. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice tight and measured, "we've observed your recent prosperity. It has raised concern." Pastor Collins took a step forward. "This woman, Miss Dalton, she carries the stain of her father's sins and her own silence. Her presence here violates the moral balance of our town." Karen's grip on the onion basket tightened until her fingers burned, but she did not move, did not flinch. Whitmore continued, "We cannot abide the harboring of someone so controversial. We're here to ask formally that you remove her from your property. If not, we are prepared to initiate proceedings to reclaim this land under the town charter's moral clause." Daniel didn't blink. He didn't argue. He raised one hand and motioned silently for the men to follow him. Confused, but too proud to question, the two figures obeyed, trailing him past the porch around the side of the house. Karen remained frozen in place. He led them to the back gate, a large wooden arch framed with old wagon wheels and rusted iron hinges. Daniel opened it slowly, stepped aside, and gestured for them to step through. As soon as both men were outside the gate, he pulled it closed with a heavy thud and secured the latch. The lock clicked like a judge's gavel. The mayor turned back, lips parted in protest, but Daniel simply raised one hand. Calm, final. He turned without a word and walked back to Karen. They stood side by side, watching the carriage depart, its wheels kicking up more noise than it had brought. That night, the wind picked up, dragging scraps of dry hay across the yard and sighing against the windows. Karen sat by the hearth with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm tea. She stared into it like it might give her the answer she still could not name. Daniel crouched beside her, not speaking, not touching, just present. His presence was solid, unmoving, like the foundation of a house in storm season. After midnight, Karen finally stood and walked toward the barn. Daniel followed. He saddled the horse without speaking, lifted her onto it, and swung up behind her. They rode out beneath the clear, star-swept sky. Miles passed in silence. Then Daniel reined in the horse and pointed upward. Above us the sky was stars burned overhead, merciless and clear. "I would lose the land. I would lose all respect. I would lose everything," he said. Then he turned to her. "But don't ever think you are not worthy of something like this." She said nothing. She only rested her head against him as they turned home. The stars watched, indifferent. But beneath them, two people no longer measured themselves by the town's shadow. They rode back not as fugitives, but as something quieter, stronger, a promise not yet spoken, but already understood. The morning she left, the ranch was cloaked in a silver mist that hadn't touched the valley in weeks. It wrapped around the trees like memory, soft and reluctant to lift. Karen stood in the doorway, her shawl drawn tight, her bag light. She looked back, not at the house, but at the porch steps, the woodpile, the dusty trail where footprints from the day before had already begun to fade. The home was never truly hers, not by deed, not by name, but it had begun to feel like it might be. She left without waking Daniel. In the kitchen, lit only by the weak dawnlight, she placed two things on the wooden table. A handkerchief frayed at the corners with his name Daniel stitched in uneven thread, and beside it a small loaf of bread still warm. The crust was split, the shape imperfect, but it was real. It smelled of effort, of care, of something she had once feared accepting. Beneath the bread she slid a folded note, 5 words written in her careful, almost schoolteacher handwriting. The bread I once feared. Then she stepped off the porch, her boots silent on the earth, and followed the winding trail through cottonwoods and red clay, past the last fence post, and into the mist. By midday the mist had burned off, but Daniel had already seen the bed untouched, the hearth cold, the kitchen altered. He stood at the table, staring at the loaf and the handkerchief. His name stitched not with skill but with sincerity. He picked up the note, read it once, and folded it carefully into his coat pocket like it was scripture. He saddled the horse without a word. No guesswork, no questions. He just knew. He rode northwest through the meadow across the old dry stream bed toward the one place that had ever held peace between them and then the crushing turmoil. He found her there beneath the crooked oak that bent toward the bluff like it was listening to the earth's secrets, the place where wind always came. First. The place where they had once sat and shared silence like it was sacred. Sharon was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes dry but distant. There was no surprise when she looked up. She had heard the horse. She had felt the shift in the air that only Daniel seemed to bring. He dismounted slowly, walked toward her, and without a word extended his hand. Karen looked at it for a long breath. Then she reached up, their fingers touched, uncertain at first, then certain enough. Their hands closed over the space between them. Still no words. They didn't need them. They walked back to the ranch on foot, the horse trailing behind, the afternoon sun climbing. At dusk, they reached the gate. The same gate Daniel had once locked against judgment. Its wood still bore scorch marks, still leaned slightly from age, but it stood and Daniel opened it. Karen stepped through. A week later, a small crowd gathered in the pasture. There was no steeple, no choir, no bouquet wrapped in ribbon, but there were chairs mismatched, creaking under the weight of children Karen had taught to read. Neighbors who once whispered now watching quietly. Karen wore a dress sewn from muslin, simple and plain. Her hair was pinned back. Daniel wore a white shirt, the same one from every Sunday. He never went to town. He slipped a ring onto her finger, crafted from a melted coin, reshaped and polished until it gleamed like nothing had ever tarnished it. She placed one on his, a loop of wire from the first fence he had built on that land. They said few words, no vows rehearsed. No preacher's blessing, just Daniel's voice, steady and true. You will never stand alone again. Then wind swept across the pasture, and they kissed, soft, uncertain, wholly real, a wedding not recognized by law, but blessed by something older, by dust, by effort, by choice. And Karen, once tied to a market post under the harsh judgment of sun and men, now stood in a field of quiet things, chosen entirely and forever by one. 3 years later, the ranch no longer stood in silence. Laughter rang through the fields like wind through wheat. Small voices, high and bright, spelling words, chasing chickens, hammering crooked nails into soft wood. Under Daniel's patient gaze, Karen sat on a low stool beneath the front awning, chalk in one hand, a worn book in the other, as she pointed to letters drawn on a plank propped against a hay bale. S is for sky, she said gently. And H is for home. A dozen little heads nodded, some dark, some golden, some copper-skinned, all watching her with wide eyes, and the kind of trust that once seemed extinct. They came from everywhere. The ranch had become a haven, not just for the two who found it, but for those who needed its quiet promise. Children of ranch hands, wanderers, freedmen, widows. They arrived with no past worth speaking of, and Karen gave them a language for their future. Daniel built the desks from pine. He taught the older ones how to mend saddles, how to treat a horse's limp, how to read a weathered sky, and know when to bring the herd in early. Some days he spoke more than anyone expected. Other days he only smiled, sitting quietly as the young ones listened to Karen read tales of faraway kings and brave girls who could not be broken. Above the door of their home, a sign hung. A patch of linen carefully embroidered in Karen's hand. Home not judged. No one asked where it came from. No one needed to. And each week, without fail, a small loaf of bread appeared on the windowsill. Sometimes sweet, sometimes crusty and plain, always warm. No one ever saw who left it, but the meaning was clear. Bread still mattered. It had begun everything. It reminded them all that kindness left in silence could echo louder than sermons ever had. Then one spring morning, with dew still on the grass and birdsongs spinning through the trees, a small voice rang out from the open doorway. Daniel turned from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, just as a little girl came barreling toward him, bare feet, curls flying, arms wide. He bent, catching her with a soft grunt, lifting her into his arms like it was the only thing he was meant to do in this life. Her laugh spilled against his chest. Karen stood just inside the doorway, watching. Her hands were still dusted with flour from kneading the morning bread. Her hair a mess of braids half fallen from a day's work and play. But her eyes, those eyes that once had only known stone and silence, were lit now with something whole. She looked at Daniel, then at their daughter curled against him, and she whispered to no one in particular. "I am your wife now, not just in grief, but in living, in hope." The wind lifted the edge of the linen sign, as if in gentle agreement. The ranch, once silent and judged, had bloomed into something else entirely. Not perfect, but not forgotten, but forgiven. And that girl, who had once been tied to a post, for the shame of someone else's sins, now stood behind her own doorframe, holding a home together with nothing but will, work, and the man who once offered her bread instead of pity. The girl, the woman, the mother. She had become all three. And she had done it not by asking permission from a world that never offered any, but by accepting a love that had spoken through action when words had failed. And Daniel, he never stopped carrying a spare loaf in his saddlebag just in case. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever believed that a simple loaf of bread could change a life or that love doesn't need permission to be real, then leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where bullets missed but hearts didn't. Here, love rises from dust, silence, and second chances. We tell the stories history forgot, but your heart never will.